Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. From a humble city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, it grew into a colossal empire, a civilization that would define the very course of Western history. Its legions were unstoppable, its engineering was revolutionary, and its laws became the bedrock of modern society. But how did this republic of farmers conquer the known world, and what seeds of destruction were sown even at the height of its power? Join us as we march through centuries of glory, betrayal, and collapse to uncover the epic story of the Roman Empire. Every great power has its origin story, a foundational myth that seeks to explain not just its beginnings, but its very soul. For Rome, that story is a brutal and poetic tale of gods, mortals, and a she-wolf. It begins not in Rome, but in Alba Longa, where King Numitor is usurped by his cruel brother, Amulius. To secure his throne, Amulius forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, sworn to chastity, ensuring no heirs can challenge his rule. But the gods, it seems, had other plans. The war god Mars descends and fathers twin sons with Rhea Silvia, Romulus and Remus. Enraged, Amulius orders the infants to be cast into the Tiber River, a death sentence for any child. Yet, destiny intervened. The basket carrying the twins washes ashore at the foot of the Palatine Hill. There, they are discovered by a she-wolf, a creature that should have been their end. Instead, in a moment of divine providence, she suckles them, keeping them alive until they are found by a shepherd named Faustulus and his wife, Acca Larentia. Raised as humble shepherds, the twins grow into natural leaders, strong and charismatic. Upon learning their true heritage, they return to Alba Longa, kill the tyrant Amulius, and restore their grandfather Numitor to the throne. But their own ambition could not be contained in an old city. They decide to found a new city of their own near the place where they were saved. This is where brotherhood turned to rivalry. To decide who would rule, they turned to augury, the practice of interpreting the will of the gods through the flight of birds. Remus, on the Aventine Hill, saw 6 vultures. Romulus, on the Palatine Hill, saw 12. The divine favor was clear. Romulus began to plow the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, around his new city. In a fit of jealousy and mockery, Remus leaped over the nascent wall, a sacrilegious act. In a flash of rage, Romulus struck his brother down, declaring, "So shall it be for all who dare to cross my walls." Rome was thus founded on fratricide, a dark seed of violence and ambition that would define its future expansion and its internal conflicts for centuries to come. The fledgling city, founded by Romulus, did not remain a simple Latin settlement for long. Its strategic location on the Tiber drew the attention of its more advanced and powerful neighbors to the north, the Etruscans. For over a century, Rome was ruled by a line of Etruscan kings, a period of significant development in which the city was transformed with grand temples, a sophisticated sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, and the introduction of new customs and technologies. The last of these kings was Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. His reign was a study in tyranny, marked by bloodshed, extravagance, and a complete disregard for Roman traditions and the nascent Senate. The Roman aristocracy, the patricians, seethed under his oppressive rule, waiting for a spark to ignite their rebellion. That spark came in the form of a profound personal tragedy, that would become a cornerstone of Roman identity. While besieging the city of Ardea, the king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, became obsessed with Lucretia, the famously virtuous wife of the nobleman Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. Visiting her late at night, Sextus threatened her with a sword, demanding she submit to him. When her virtue proved stronger than her fear of death, he threatened to kill her and a male slave, placing their bodies together to frame her for adultery. To spare her family this unbearable shame, Lucretia yielded. The next day she summoned her father and husband, told them what had happened, made them swear an oath of vengeance, and then plunged a dagger into her own heart. She would not live with the dishonor. Her sacrifice was not in vain. A kinsman, Lucius Junius Brutus, who had played the fool for years to survive Tarquin's court, seized the moment. He carried Lucretia's body to the Roman Forum, displaying it for all to see. He delivered a fiery speech condemning the Tarquins and their tyranny. The outrage was universal. The people of Rome, stirred by Brutus's call to action, rose up, drove Tarquin and his family into exile, and abolished the monarchy forever. In its place, in the year 509 BC, they established a new form of government, the res publica, the public affair. Power would no longer rest in the hands of one man, but would be shared between two annually elected consuls and the Senate. The Roman Republic was born, forged in the crucible of tyranny and personal sacrifice. The overthrow of the monarchy did not create a society of equals. The new Roman Republic was a state controlled by a privileged few. Society was sharply divided into two classes, or orders, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the aristocracy, the wealthy landowners who traced their lineage back to the first senators appointed by Romulus. They held all political, religious, and military power. The plebeians, on the other hand, were the vast majority of the population: farmers, merchants, artisans, and laborers. Despite being citizens who were required to serve in the army and pay taxes, they were barred from holding political office, excluded from the most important priesthoods, and were not even privy to the laws, which were an unwritten tradition interpreted solely by patrician magistrates. This fundamental inequality created a deep and lasting tension that defined the first 2 centuries of the Republic. The plebeians were the backbone of the Roman army, yet they often returned from war to find their farms neglected and themselves in crippling debt to patrician lenders. The punishment for debt was severe, including enslavement. By 494 BC, the plebeians had reached their breaking point. In a revolutionary act of mass civil disobedience, they seceded from Rome. They withdrew from the city en masse to the nearby Sacred Mount, refusing to work or fight until their grievances were addressed. This was the first secessio plebis, a general strike that paralyzed the state. The patricians, realizing they could not defend Rome or run the city without the plebs, were forced to compromise. This first secession led to the creation of a powerful new office, the tribune of the plebs. These officials, elected by the plebeians themselves, had the extraordinary power to veto the actions of any patrician magistrate. Over the next 2 centuries, the plebeians continued their struggle. They fought for and won the right to have the laws written down and published on 12 tables in the Forum for all to see. They gained the right to intermarry with patricians and, eventually, the right to hold the highest offices in the state, including the consulship itself. This long, arduous struggle of the orders fundamentally reshaped Rome, transforming it from a rigid aristocracy into a more complex and, for its time, more representative republic. Having consolidated its control over the Italian peninsula, the Roman Republic now looked outward, its gaze falling upon the wider Mediterranean world. But the sea was not empty. It was dominated by a formidable maritime power, a city that had for centuries controlled the trade routes of the Western Mediterranean: Carthage. Located on the coast of modern-day Tunisia, Carthage was a Phoenician colony that had grown into a vast commercial empire. The clash between these two rising powers was inevitable, a struggle for supremacy that would span over a century and be fought in 3 brutal conflicts known as the Punic Wars. The first war erupted in 264 BC over the island of Sicily, a strategic and agricultural prize lying between Italy and Africa. Rome was a land power, its strength residing in its disciplined legions. Carthage was a sea power, its might vested in its massive navy. To challenge Carthage, Rome had to become something it was not. In an incredible feat of reverse engineering and mass production, the Romans built a fleet from scratch, modeling it on a captured Carthaginian warship. They compensated for their lack of naval experience by inventing a new weapon: the corvus, a large boarding bridge that could be dropped onto an enemy ship, allowing their superior soldiers to storm across and fight as if on land. After more than 2 decades of grueling warfare, Rome emerged victorious, seizing Sicily and forcing Carthage to pay a heavy indemnity. But the peace was merely an intermission. A new generation of Carthaginian leaders, embodied by the brilliant and ruthless Barcid family, swore eternal hatred for Rome. It was Hamilcar Barca's son, Hannibal, who would bring Rome to the very edge of destruction. In 218 BC, Hannibal initiated the Second Punic War with one of the most audacious military maneuvers in history. He marched his army, complete with dozens of war elephants, from Spain, across the Pyrenees, and the treacherous, snow-covered Alps, descending into Italy from the north, where the Romans least expected him. For the next 15 years, he would terrorize Italy, inflicting a series of catastrophic defeats on the legions at the battles of the Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and, most devastatingly, at Cannae, where he annihilated a Roman army twice the size of his own. Rome was on its knees, its allies wavering, its very survival hanging by a thread. The year 216 BC marked the nadir of Roman fortunes. Following the cataclysmic defeat at Cannae, where the legions were not merely beaten but annihilated, a palpable terror gripped the city of Rome. The phrase, Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal at the gates, was no longer a hypothetical warning, but a dreadful, imminent possibility. The city's defenses were manned by the elderly and the very young, as the flower of its fighting-age population lay dead on the plains of Apulia. Panic led to grim portents and a return to ancient, dark rituals, including the horrifying spectacle of human sacrifice, a practice long abandoned as desperate citizens sought to appease the gods who had seemingly forsaken them. In the Senate, debate raged. Some argued for suing for peace, an unthinkable act for the proud republic. But the old guard, embodying the mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors, refused to yield. They forbade public mourning, forcing the city to swallow its grief and project an image of unbreakable resolve. It was in this crucible of fear and defiance that Rome's true character was forged. The strategy that would ultimately save the Republic came from a man whose methods were initially despised. Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointed dictator, understood a truth his more aggressive colleagues had paid for in blood. Hannibal could not be defeated in a pitched battle. The Carthaginian general was a peerless tactician, with a veteran army hardened by years of campaigning. Fabius instead adopted a strategy of attrition and delay, earning him the derogatory cognomen Cunctator, the delayer. He shadowed Hannibal's army, refusing to be drawn into open combat. His forces launched guerrilla-style raids, attacked foraging parties, and harassed Hannibal's supply lines, waging a war of exhaustion. This Fabian strategy was deeply unpopular. It seemed cowardly to the Roman psyche, which craved a decisive, vengeful victory. Political rivals mocked him, and the Roman people grew impatient, watching an enemy army wander their homeland with impunity. Yet, Fabius's wisdom was profound. He recognized that Hannibal's greatest weakness was his isolation. Far from Carthage, with no reliable supply base and wavering support from his new Italian allies, Hannibal's army was a finite resource. Every skirmish, every loss of a soldier or a horse, was a wound he could not easily heal. Fabius was not fighting to win a single battle. He was fighting to win the war by slowly bleeding his opponent dry, giving Rome the one thing it needed most: time to rebuild, regroup, and recover its strength. With Carthage finally humbled at the conclusion of the Second Punic War, Rome stood as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. Its gaze now turned eastward, toward the glittering, ancient, and immensely wealthy world of the Hellenistic kingdoms, the successor states born from the fractured empire of Alexander the Great. This was a world of powerful dynasties, sprawling cities, and sophisticated culture, dominated by the Antigonids in Macedon, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. Rome's initial interventions were cloaked in the noble language of liberation. Acting as a protector of smaller Greek city-states like Pergamon and Rhodes, who feared the expansionist ambitions of Philip V of Macedon, Rome presented itself as a champion of Greek freedom against tyrannical kings. The decisive clash came at the Battle of Cynocephalae in 197 BC. Here, the disciplined flexibility of the Roman legion proved decisively superior to the rigid, spear-bristling wall of the Macedonian phalanx. The victory was total. In a masterful act of political theater, the Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games, earning Rome immense goodwill. However, this freedom was a Roman gift, and it could be just as easily rescinded. The mask of liberator began to slip as Roman influence deepened. The formidable Seleucid Empire under Antiochus III challenged Rome's new role, leading to another war. At the Battle of Magnesia in 190 BC, Roman legions under Scipio Asiaticus, brother of Africanus, crushed the much larger Seleucid force, effectively ending their status as a great power and opening up Asia Minor to Roman domination. The final act of Greek independence played out in the mid-2nd century BC. After a Third Macedonian War, Rome dissolved the Kingdom of Macedon. Growing Greek resentment against Roman arrogance and interference culminated in a revolt by the Achaean League. The response was brutal and unequivocal. In 146 BC, the same year Carthage was razed to the ground, the consul Lucius Mummius captured and utterly destroyed the ancient and revered city of Corinth. Its treasures were looted, its buildings demolished, and its citizens sold into slavery. The message was clear. Roman patronage had transformed into Roman dominion. The conquest of the East flooded Rome with unimaginable wealth, art, and new ideas. But it also fundamentally and irrevocably altered the Republic, setting it on a path toward empire and exposing it to the corrupting influence of absolute power. By the latter half of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic was suffering from a profound internal sickness. The immense wealth plundered from its conquests in the East had flowed into the hands of a small senatorial elite, creating a vast and growing gap between the rich and the poor. The very foundation of the Republic, the small independent farmer, who had served as the backbone of the citizen army, was being systematically destroyed. While these soldiers fought Rome's wars abroad, their family farms fell into debt and were swallowed up by the aristocracy, who consolidated them into massive, slave-run plantations known as latifundia. This process created a disenfranchised, landless class that flooded into Rome, forming a volatile urban proletariat, while simultaneously shrinking the pool of property-owning citizens eligible for military service. This social and military crisis formed the backdrop for the dramatic rise of Tiberius Gracchus. Elected tribune of the plebs in 133 BC, Tiberius, himself an aristocrat, proposed a seemingly moderate solution: enforce a long-forgotten law that limited the amount of public land any one individual could hold. The state would repossess the excess land and redistribute it in small plots to the landless poor. However, his method was revolutionary. Facing intractable opposition from the Senate, whose members were the primary beneficiaries of the illegal landholdings, Tiberius bypassed them entirely and passed his law through the plebeian assembly. When a fellow tribune vetoed his proposal, Tiberius had him deposed, an unprecedented act that shattered political norms. The Senate saw him not as a reformer, but as a demagogue aiming for tyranny. The confrontation culminated in a bloody riot, where Tiberius and hundreds of his followers were clubbed to death by a mob of senators and their clients. A decade later, his younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the cause with even greater ambition. As tribune, Gaius enacted a sweeping legislative program that included not just land reform, but also state-subsidized grain for the urban poor, public works projects to create jobs, and a controversial proposal to extend Roman citizenship to the Italian allies. The senatorial elite, fearing his immense popularity and power, responded with a new and terrible weapon: the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, or final decree of the Senate, which empowered the consuls to use any means necessary to preserve the Republic. Declared a public enemy, Gaius was hunted down and killed, along with thousands of his supporters, in 121 BC. The Gracchi had failed, but their legacy was transformative. They had exposed the deep fissures within Roman society and, tragically, had introduced political violence as a legitimate tool, setting a dark precedent that would pave the way for a century of civil war. The social and military crises left unresolved after the death of the Gracchi brothers came to a head at the close of the 2nd century BC. The Republic faced a series of humiliating military defeats, most notably against the Numidian king Jugurtha in North Africa, which exposed deep-seated corruption and incompetence within the senatorial command. A far greater existential threat then emerged from the north, as vast migrations of Germanic tribes, the Cimbri and Teutones, shattered one Roman army after another, threatening to invade Italy itself. The traditional Roman military system, reliant on a militia of land-owning citizens, was proving inadequate for the demands of sustained, long-term warfare. In this moment of crisis, Rome turned to a novus homo, or new man, Gaius Marius. A brilliant soldier from outside the traditional aristocracy, Marius was elected consul, in 107 BC on a promise to end the war in Numidia and reform the army. His reforms were not merely tactical adjustments. They were a fundamental restructuring of the Roman military that would echo for centuries. His most revolutionary act was to abolish the property qualification for military service. He opened the ranks to the capitescensi, the landless masses, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. These men were not fighting out of civic duty, but for a career. The state, not the individual soldier, now provided standardized weapons, armor, and equipment. Marius also reorganized the legion's structure, making the cohort of roughly 480 men its primary tactical unit, which provided greater flexibility on the battlefield. He drilled his troops relentlessly, subjecting them to grueling route marches, carrying all their own equipment, from entrenching tools to rations, which earned them the affectionate nickname Marius's Mules. The result was a disciplined, standardized, and highly professional fighting force. Marius's new army was a spectacular success, defeating Jugurtha, and then, in 2 decisive battles, annihilating the Cimbri and Teutones, saving Rome from invasion. However, in solving one crisis, Marius had created another. The loyalty of these new professional soldiers lay not with the distant and abstract Senate, but with the general who led them to victory, provided them with pay and plunder, and most importantly, promised them a plot of land upon retirement. Marius had forged the tool that would ultimately dismantle the Republic, the client army, a private force loyal to its commander. He had created the legions that Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar would one day turn against Rome itself. The Roman Republic, in the early 1st century BC, was a powder keg of social and political tension. For generations, its Italian allies, the Socii, had fought and died alongside Roman legions, contributing manpower and resources to the expansion of an empire from which they were excluded as citizens. They paid taxes and served in the military, but had no voice in the Senate, no vote in the assemblies. The assassination of the reformer Livius Drusus in 91 BC, who had championed their cause for citizenship, was the final spark. The result was the Social War, a brutal and bloody conflict that pitted Rome against its own Italian kinsmen. This was not a war against a foreign enemy. It was a civil war, in all but name, fought with Roman tactics and Roman weapons on both sides. The fighting was ferocious, devastating the Italian peninsula and costing hundreds of thousands of lives. In the midst of this chaos, 2 figures rose to prominence: the aging but still formidable Gaius Marius and his ambitious, ruthless subordinate, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. While Rome ultimately prevailed militarily, it was a Pyrrhic victory. To end the bloodshed and resecure the loyalty of the Italians, Rome was forced to grant the very thing the Allies had fought for: full Roman citizenship. This act fundamentally transformed the Republic, expanding its citizen body across the entire Italian peninsula. However, the peace was short-lived. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla, stoked by the war, exploded into open conflict over command in the war against Mithridates of Pontus. In an unprecedented and shocking move, Sulla marched his own legions on Rome itself, a sacred taboo shattered forever. After driving Marius into exile, Sulla departed for the east. Upon his victorious return, he faced a city controlled by his enemies. Another, even more vicious civil war erupted. Sulla emerged triumphant and, in 82 BC, had himself declared dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic. a title that gave him absolute power with no term limit. He unleashed a terrifying wave of prescriptions, posting lists of his political enemies who could be killed on sight, their property confiscated by the state. Thousands perished. Sulla then enacted sweeping constitutional reforms aiming to restore the authority of the Senate and curb the power of the tribunes and generals he believed had corrupted the Republic. Then, in a move that has puzzled historians for centuries, he voluntarily resigned his dictatorship in 79 BC and retired to private life, dying a year later. He had reshaped Rome through sheer terror and force of will, but his legacy was a dangerous one. He had shown that the ultimate power in Rome no longer resided in the Senate, but with the man who could command the loyalty of an army. In 73 BC, from the heart of Campania, an uprising began that would shake the Roman Republic to its core. It started not in the Senate or the Forum, but in the brutal confines of a gladiatorial school in Capua, owned by Lentulus Batiatus. Here, a Thracian named Spartacus, a man likely forced into servitude after a military career, plotted an escape. Alongside 70 or so fellow gladiators, armed with little more than kitchen implements and stolen weapons, they broke free. This small act of defiance rapidly snowballed into the largest slave rebellion Rome had ever faced, known as the Third Servile War. As news of their freedom spread, their ranks swelled with runaway slaves, shepherds, and the rural poor from across the Italian countryside, all drawn to the promise of liberation from a life of brutal oppression. Spartacus proved to be a leader of extraordinary talent, a brilliant military tactician who organized this disparate mob into a disciplined and effective fighting force. For 2 years, this army of the disenfranchised marched up and down the Italian peninsula, achieving a series of stunning victories against Roman forces. They defeated 2 consular armies and several praetorian guards, humiliating the seemingly invincible Roman military machine. The Roman elite, who had initially dismissed the revolt as a minor policing matter, grew increasingly panicked as Spartacus's army, now numbering over 100,000 heads, seemed unstoppable. However, the rebel army was plagued by internal divisions. While Spartacus reportedly wished to lead his people north, over the Alps, to freedom in their homelands, other factions, led by commanders like Crixus, preferred to stay in Italy to plunder its riches. This split proved fatal. After Crixus and his contingent were defeated and killed, Spartacus turned back south, his ultimate goal now unclear. The Roman Senate, desperate, finally turned to one of its wealthiest and most ambitious citizens, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Granted special command and immense resources, Crassus raised a massive new army and pursued Spartacus with relentless determination. He cornered the slave army in the toe of Italy, trapping them with a massive wall of fortifications. After a desperate and failed attempt to break out, the final battle was fought in 71 BC. The rebel army was annihilated, and Spartacus himself fell in the fray, his body never identified. Crassus, in a chilling display of Roman power, had 6,000 captured survivors crucified along the Appian Way, a gruesome warning to any who would dare challenge the authority of Rome. The rebellion was crushed, but the legend of Spartacus, the gladiator who made Rome tremble, would endure for millennia. By 60 BC, the Roman Republic was a playground for powerful, ambitious men whose personal aspirations far outweighed their loyalty to the state. The traditional political system, designed for a city-state, was buckling under the weight of a vast empire. In this volatile environment, 3 of these men, each a titan in his own right, decided that cooperation was more beneficial than competition. They formed a private, informal political alliance that would come to be known as the First Triumvirate. This was not an official office of state, but a secret pact to subvert the Senate and concentrate power in their own hands. The first member was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great. He was Rome's most celebrated general, having cleared the Mediterranean of pirates and achieved glorious victories in the east. Yet, upon his return, the conservative faction of the Senate, the Optimates, foolishly snubbed him, refusing to ratify his eastern settlements or grant land to his loyal veterans. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, arguably the richest man in Rome. His vast wealth, derived from real estate speculation and silver mines, bought him immense influence. But he craved the one thing money couldn't buy: military glory and the respect that came with it. A glory that constantly eluded him and was possessed in abundance by Pompey. The third and final member was the charismatic and politically brilliant Gaius Julius Caesar. A man from an old patrician family but with populist leanings, Caesar was deeply in debt but possessed boundless ambition. He needed the triumvirate to bypass senatorial opposition and secure a powerful command that would allow him to build his own fortune and military reputation. Together, they were an unstoppable force. Crassus's money funded Caesar's political campaigns. Pompey's veterans provided the muscle and popular support. Caesar's political acumen and popular appeal provided the legislative vehicle. In 59 BC, they successfully engineered Caesar's election to the consulship. As consul, Caesar ruthlessly pushed through the legislation his partners desired. Pompey's veterans got their land. Crassus received favorable tax breaks for his equestrian allies. And most importantly, Caesar secured for himself a 5-year proconsular command over the provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. This alliance effectively paralyzed the traditional republican government. The Senate was powerless to stop them, and figures like Cicero and Cato the Younger could only watch in dismay as 3 men dictated the fate of the republic for their own personal gain. The first triumvirate was a pact of convenience, built on ambition and self-interest, and it set Rome on a direct path to civil war and the eventual collapse of the Republic. When Julius Caesar began his proconsulship in Gaul in 58 BC, few in Rome could have predicted the monumental consequences. His command was seen as a political stepping stone, a way to escape his creditors and build a power base. Yet, over the next 8 years, Caesar would not only conquer a vast territory stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, but also forge one of the most loyal and battle-hardened armies in history, forever altering his own destiny and that of Rome. The Gallic Wars were not a single planned campaign of conquest, but a series of opportunistic and often brutal conflicts, which Caesar himself masterfully documented and spun in his Commentarii de Bello Gallico. He began by repelling the migrating Helvetii tribe and then defeating the Germanic leader Ariovistus, establishing Roman dominance in the region. Year after year, he pushed deeper into Gaul, putting down rebellions, forging alliances, and fighting numerous tribes, from the Belgae in the north to the Aquitani in the south. He was a commander of unparalleled genius, known for his lightning-fast marches, innovative engineering feats like building a bridge across the Rhine in just 10 days, and his willingness to share the hardships of his men, which earned him their fanatical devotion. His ambition was limitless, even leading audacious but ultimately inconclusive expeditions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC. The pinnacle of his campaign came in 52 BC, with the Great Revolt of the Gallic tribes, united for the first time under a charismatic Arverni chieftain, Vercingetorix. This was the greatest threat Caesar ever faced. Vercingetorix led a brilliant campaign, forcing Caesar into a desperate pursuit that culminated at the fortified hilltop town of Alesia. In a masterpiece of siege warfare, Caesar constructed an incredible set of two concentric walls, one to keep Vercingetorix's army trapped inside the town, and an outer one to defend against a massive Gallic relief army. Against all odds, Caesar's legions held, starving the defenders into submission and crushing the relief force. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked the effective end of Gallic resistance. By 50 BC, Gaul was pacified. The conquest came at an immense human cost, with ancient sources claiming 1 million Gauls killed and another 1 million enslaved. For Caesar, it was an unmitigated triumph. He had acquired immense wealth, a vast new province for Rome, and, most critically, a private army of veteran legions whose loyalty was to him and him alone. This power shift did not go unnoticed in Rome. With Crassus dead and Pompey now allied with the Senate, Caesar's staggering success had made him too powerful. The stage was now set for the final, inevitable confrontation. The year is 49 BC. The Roman Republic, a beacon of law and order for centuries, teeters on the brink of self-destruction. The delicate balance of power, once maintained by the first triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, has shattered. With Crassus dead in Parthia, the two remaining titans, Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, circle each other like wary predators. Caesar, fresh from his brilliant and brutal conquest of Gaul, commands a legion of battle-hardened veterans fiercely loyal to him alone. In Rome, the Senate, championing Pompey, watches Caesar's rising star with a mixture of awe and terror. They see not a victorious general, but a potential tyrant, a king in all but name, who threatens the very foundations of the Republic. They issue an ultimatum. Caesar must disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand for the consulship. To obey is to face certain political ruin and prosecution by his enemies. To refuse is to declare war on his own country. The border between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy is a small, insignificant river called the Rubicon. By Roman law, no general was permitted to lead an army across it into Italy. It was the ultimate line in the sand. On the cold night of January 10th, Caesar stood on the northern bank, contemplating a decision that would change the course of Western history. For hours he debated with his commanders, weighing the consequences. This was not merely a political gamble, it was an act of irreversible rebellion. Finally, his mind was made up. He reportedly uttered the now immortal words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. With that, he led the 13th Legion across the shallow waters. The Rubicon was crossed. There was no turning back. The civil war had begun. Italy was thrown into chaos as Caesar advanced with lightning speed, his reputation preceding him. Town after town opened its gates, not to a conqueror, but to a popular hero. Pompey and the panicked senators, caught completely off guard by the audacity and speed of Caesar's move, abandoned Rome and fled to Greece to rally their forces. The war would rage across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Egypt, culminating in the decisive Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar's tactical genius would shatter Pompey's larger army. Pompey would flee to Egypt, only to be ignominiously murdered, his head presented to a reportedly disgusted Caesar. The crossing of the Rubicon was more than a military maneuver. It was the death knell of the Roman Republic. Caesar's victory in the Civil War was absolute. He returned to Rome not as a general, but as its undisputed master. The Senate, depleted and subservient, showered him with honors, eventually declaring him dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. For many Romans, he was a savior who had ended decades of bloody internal conflict. He initiated popular reforms, revised the calendar, and planned ambitious public works projects. But for a faction of the aristocracy, his power was an abomination. They saw the traditions of the Republic, which had stood for nearly 500 years, being dismantled before their very eyes. The specter of monarchy, a concept deeply reviled since the overthrow of the ancient kings, loomed large. Whispers in the shadowy corridors of power grew into a deadly conspiracy. The plot was led by two men of contrasting character: Gaius Cassius Longinus, a bitter and pragmatic man who had long held a grudge against Caesar, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a respected statesman who Caesar had pardoned and even favored. Brutus, a descendant of the man who had expelled Rome's last king, was tormented by his duty to the Republic versus his personal affection for Caesar. The conspirators, calling themselves the Liberatores, or Liberators, believed that only one act could save Rome: tyrannicide. They chose the Ides of March, March 15th, 44th BC, as the day of reckoning. The location was the portico of the Theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting. As Caesar entered, he was surrounded by the plotters under the pretense of presenting a petition. One senator pulled at his toga, the prearranged signal. Immediately, the others drew their daggers. It was a frenzied, brutal attack. Caesar fought back, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. According to the historian Suetonius, he saw Brutus among his attackers, a man he had treated like a son. In that moment of ultimate betrayal, he is said to have uttered in Greek, "Kai su, teknon," "You too, my child." He then pulled his toga over his head, resigning to his fate, and fell at the foot of a statue of his great rival, Pompey, stabbed 23 times. The assassins, their hands and togas stained with blood, raised their daggers and declared that the tyrant was dead. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. Instead of being hailed as heroes who had restored liberty, they were met with a stunned and fearful silence from the senators, and growing rage from the Roman populace, who had adored Caesar. The assassination did not save the Republic. It plunged it into another, even more vicious cycle of civil war, ultimately paving the way for the very thing the conspirators had sought to prevent: the absolute rule of one man. The assassination of Julius Caesar did not restore the Republic. It shattered it completely. In the chaotic power vacuum that followed, three men emerged to pick up the pieces and avenge the fallen dictator. They were Marcus Antonius, or Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal and charismatic general; Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a powerful patrician; and a surprisingly formidable newcomer, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's 18-year-old grandnephew and adopted heir. Known to history as Octavian, this young man possessed a political cunning and ruthless ambition that belied his age. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a formal three-man dictatorship with the power to rule by decree. Their first act was a brutal prescription, a state-sanctioned murder list of their political enemies, including the great orator Cicero. With their rivals in Rome eliminated, they turned their attention to Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, decisively defeating them at the Battle of Philippi in Greece. With the liberatories dead, the triumvirate divided the Roman world amongst themselves. But this alliance of convenience was destined to crumble. Lepidus was soon sidelined, leaving the two most powerful men, Antony and Octavian, on an inevitable collision course. Antony, who controlled the wealthy eastern provinces, fell under the spell of the captivating Egyptian queen, Cleopatra. In Rome, Octavian, a master of propaganda, skillfully portrayed Antony as a decadent, Eastern-style despot who had abandoned his Roman heritage for a foreign queen. He painted their rivalry not as a personal power struggle, but as a war for the very soul of Rome. The final confrontation came in 31 BC at the naval battle of Actium. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant general Marcus Agrippa, crushed the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra. The lovers fled back to Egypt, where they would ultimately take their own lives, leaving Octavian as the sole, undisputed master of the Roman world. Wary of Caesar's fate, however, Octavian knew that titles like king or dictator were a death sentence. He performed a political masterstroke. In 27 BC, he made a great show of returning power to the Senate and the people of Rome. In gratitude, the Senate bestowed upon him the new, revered title of Augustus, the illustrious one. He called himself Princeps, or first citizen, maintaining the illusion that he was merely the first among equals. But it was a carefully crafted facade. Behind the restored institutions of the Republic, he held absolute authority over the armies, the finances, and the provinces. The Republic was dead. The Roman Empire had been born. With the end of a century of brutal civil wars, the reign of Augustus ushered in an era of unprecedented peace and stability that would last for over 200 years, the Pax Romana, or Roman peace. This was not a period entirely without conflict. Legions continued to guard and expand the frontiers, clashing with Germanic tribes in the north, Parthians in the east, and quelling rebellions in provinces like Judea. But for the vast majority of the estimated 70 million people living within the empire's sprawling borders, from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Mesopotamia, it was a time of remarkable tranquility and prosperity. The chaos and uncertainty of the late Republic were replaced by the rule of law and the steady, powerful hand of a single emperor. Augustus and his successors understood that military might alone could not hold such a diverse empire together. They became master builders and administrators. An extraordinary network of stone-paved roads was constructed, famously proclaiming that all roads lead to Rome. These arteries of the empire allowed for the swift movement of troops, officials, and, most importantly, trade. Goods flowed freely across the Mediterranean, which the Romans called Mare Nostrum, our sea. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, silk from the distant east, and olive oil from Spain created a vibrant, integrated economy on a scale never before seen. This economic boom funded magnificent public works. Cities across the empire were adorned with temples, forums, theaters, and public baths. Aqueducts, marvels of engineering, brought fresh water to burgeoning urban populations, improving sanitation and public health. A single standardized currency and a unified legal system made commerce and travel easier and safer than ever before. This stable environment fostered a cultural golden age. Under the patronage of Augustus, poets like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid produced literary masterpieces, Historians like Livy chronicled Rome's epic story. The peace established by Augustus and largely maintained by the succession of emperors, including the so-called five good emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, became the enduring legacy of Rome. It was this long peace that allowed Roman culture, language, and institutions to take deep root across Europe and the Mediterranean, shaping the very course of Western civilization for millennia to come. It was the ultimate dividend of absolute power, a golden era forged from the ashes of the Republic. With the annulment settled, Anne of Cleves, now elevated to the unprecedented position of the king's beloved sister, became a privileged spectator to the continuing drama of Henry VIII's court. This new Tudor dynasty of queens, with its rapid, violent turnover, resembled the chaotic excesses of any ancient imperial family. From the comfort and security of her new estates, including the magnificent Richmond Palace, Anne watched as Henry plunged headfirst into his fifth marriage with the teenage Catherine Howard. The court erupted in a dizzying display of youthful folly and extravagance, a world away from the measured dignity Anne had projected. Feasts, masks, and hunts became the order of the day, all centered around a king besotted with his young bride. Yet, this was a dynasty built on the excesses of one man's ego and paranoia. Henry's generosity was matched only by his capacity for cruelty. While Anne cultivated her gardens, managed her finances, and established a reputation as a benevolent landowner, the court was a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue. Anne's own household became a haven of stability, a stark contrast to the precariousness of life at the heart of power. She was no longer a player in the primary game, but a powerful piece held in reserve, her status and wealth guaranteed by the very king who had cast her aside. The inevitable fall of Catherine Howard for infidelity was a brutal spectacle, another victim of the Tudor emperor's wrath. When the executioner's axe fell in February 1542, Anne had outlived yet another of Henry's queens. Her quiet, prudent life, free from the dangerous excesses of the royal bedchamber, had once again proven to be the most astute survival strategy. She had traded a crown for something far more valuable: security and autonomy in a world of lethal caprice. As Henry VIII entered his final years, the Kingdom of England began to resemble an empire on the brink of crisis. The king, now married to his sixth wife, the pragmatic Catherine Parr, was a shadow of his former self. Grossly obese, in constant agony from a suppurating ulcer on his leg, his infamous temper became more volatile and unpredictable than ever. The court, once a center of Renaissance glamour, was now governed by fear and uncertainty. This was the crisis of the Tudor succession. With an underage male heir, Edward, and two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, once declared illegitimate, the future of the realm was perilously fragile. Factions at court, primarily the conservative Catholics, led by the Howards, and the reformist Protestants, circled like vultures, positioning themselves for the power vacuum that Henry's death would inevitably create. The atmosphere was thick with conspiracy, culminating in the arrest and execution of Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, and the imprisonment of his father, the Duke of Norfolk. In this treacherous landscape, Anne of Cleves played her hand with masterful subtlety. She understood that the key to her long-term survival lay not with the dying king, but with his children. She carefully cultivated warm and personal relationships with all three. She exchanged New Year's gifts with them, maintained friendly correspondence, and was a welcome visitor in their households. To the staunchly Catholic Mary, she was a sympathetic figure, another woman wronged by her father. To the Protestant-raised Elizabeth and Edward, she was a kind, non-threatening foreign relative. While the great men of England gambled their lives and fortunes on factional politics, Anne invested in personal connections. She was building bridges to every possible future, ensuring that no matter which child inherited the throne, the king's beloved sister would remain a respected and secure figure. Her foresight during this national crisis was her ultimate masterstroke. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 heralded a new era of radical change, akin to a series of sweeping imperial reforms. With the 9-year-old Edward VI on the throne, power was seized by a council of reformers led by his uncle, Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset. England was to be reshaped. The old religious compromises of Henry's reign were swept away in favor of an uncompromisingly Protestant agenda. This program of reform created a profound division within the Empire of England. The introduction of the Book of Common Prayer in English, the whitewashing of church walls, and the destruction of religious icons and stained glass alienated a large portion of the population that still clung to traditional Catholic worship. This schism led to widespread unrest, including the Prayer Book Rebellion of 1549. For Anne of Cleves, this new, ideologically driven court presented a different kind of danger. As a German princess with moderate Lutheran sympathies, she was theologically closer to the new regime than the old one. Yet she was also a relic of a past they were determined to erase. She was no longer the sister of the reigning king, but a wealthy foreign dowager in an increasingly xenophobic and politically unstable nation. Wisely, she chose a path of strategic withdrawal. This was her own personal division of her life, separating herself from the political center in London to focus on the secure management of her vast estates. She remained on cordial terms with the new government, but kept her distance, avoiding any entanglement in the power struggles that saw Somerset fall from power, only to be replaced by the even more radical John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. From her countryside manors, she managed her affairs, maintained her household, and watched as the kingdom fractured over the very questions of faith she had so carefully navigated years before. Her continued prosperity was a testament to her ability to adapt, staying out of the fray, while the nation redefined itself around her. The brief, zealous reign of Edward VI ended with his death in 1553, triggering the final dramatic chapter of Anne's life. After the failed 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey, a new ruler emerged, driven by a singular, fervent mission, much like a Tudor Constantine. Mary IV, Henry VIII's first daughter, came to the throne determined to restore the true faith of Christianity, Catholicism, to England. Her accession marked the fall of the West, the complete collapse of the Protestant establishment that had governed for the past 6 years. For Anne, this was initially a moment of great honor. She and Princess Elizabeth rode in a chariot together in Mary's coronation procession, a public symbol of solidarity among the women wronged by Henry VIII. Queen Mary treated her former stepmother with genuine warmth and respect, granting her precedence over all other ladies of the realm, save the Queen's own sister. It seemed Anne's careful diplomacy had paid its final dividend. However, the new regime's piety soon acquired a brutal edge. The beginning of the Marian persecutions, which saw hundreds of Protestants burned at the stake, cast a dark shadow over the realm. When the Wyatt Rebellion broke out in 1554 to protest Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, the Queen's paranoia spiked. The rebellion implicated Princess Elizabeth, and even Anne of Cleves fell under a brief cloud of suspicion, though she was quickly exonerated. It was a stark reminder that even in her quiet retirement, danger was never far away. Anne spent her last years in peaceful obscurity, dying at her Chelsea home in July 1557. In a final act of respect, Queen Mary ordered a magnificent royal funeral for her. Anne of Cleves was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, the only one of Henry VIII's wives to receive such an honor. She had outlived the king, his son, and all his other queens, dying not on the scaffold, but as a wealthy and respected princess. She had not just survived, she had prevailed.